Both Kobe Bryant and Tiger Woods were relentless with their practice. They spent thousands of hours honing their craft in the gym or on the course. While this created a tremendous advantage, it also broke down their bodies. What if there was a way that they could have achieved the same results with dramatically less repetition, in turn reducing their physical sacrifices? Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Will Wu, who specializes in motor control and motor learning, the stealth sciences that underlie the effectiveness of our approach to practice. In this episode, we learn how some of the underlying mechanisms of motor learning works, what most athletes are missing in their approach to skill development, and the types of practice that give you the most bang for your buck. Dr. Will Wu, welcome to the Exponential Athlete Podcast.
Good to be here, Ken.
So you referred to me by Mark Blackburn, who is widely considered arguably the best coach in golf right now. And with that recommendation, there's no way I couldn't have you on the podcast. You're working in a field that is, I think, largely flying under the radar as it relates to elite performance. And I wanted to make sure I had you come on to, one, tell your story, but also to maybe shed some light on how we can benefit, or athletes can benefit, from understanding motor learning control better.
Oh, for sure. I just need to add that Mark is probably one of the, just from a general context, like outside of golf, probably one of the most progressive information-seeking coaches there is. So I don't think there's a surprise that he is where he is. Like whenever he has, on social media, whenever he has like his accolades or whatever, I'll always put like that Nate Diaz video of "I'm not surprised, mother effers."
Exactly.
With him, I'm never surprised, just because of the way he seeks information.
Well, I think what he's doing is a beautiful thing. Is he's consistently observing, trying to understand anything that could possibly help his golfers or himself better understand the game.
Yeah.
And that's also one of the goals of this podcast, is to look at a broad spectrum, try to do deep, nuanced study of a lot of these things, because, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of watered down information out there. And so I wanted to drink straight from the source in terms of motor learning control and talk to you.
No, I appreciate that.
So first of all, I want to ask you maybe a slightly controversial question. Is muscle memory a myth?
I'll answer that with this. I usually tell my undergraduate students and my graduate students, I always have a question on the exam that says, muscle memory exists, true or false? And if they get that question wrong, then they automatically flunk the class, regardless of how well they're doing. So the answer is, it's a myth. There's no such thing as muscle memory. I always say that if we want to be if there's a nuance of truth to that, from a material science standpoint, there is muscle has memory from the standpoint of, like, if I took a piece of paper and I folded it and then I let it go, well, that paper is going to go back to like its original flat self, right? So from that perspective, you could say, from a material science perspective, muscle has memory, but not in terms of coordinating complex movements. No, it doesn't exist.
So if there isn't this concept of muscle memory, what is the mechanism behind coordinating these complex movements?
Yeah, I think the muscles are more of an issue of, they're just there to support the nervous system and the commands of the nervous system, or to carry out what the nervous system wants it to do. So I think if you take it away from the muscle level and you look at how is the nervous system coordinating movement, how's the nervous system taking in various types of sensory information, controlling in the moment what's going on, and then over time, when we talk about motor learning or the learning components of it, developing coordinated movement patterns, it opens up a world in terms of how you approach how people have really wonderful competitive performances, and how people learn from a training perspective and practice perspective, which most people will never see, but that's where the gold is in those sessions.
So it seems like basically the muscles are just the vassals for this motor control system.
Correct.
And, you know, let's dive a little bit deeper into how that motor control system works. So how does that motor control system relate to motor learning? How does that essentially affect us being able to just talk about it, from going all the way to hitting a golf ball or maybe making a 3-pointer?
Yeah, oftentimes those two terms get confused. It's motor control and learning, and people think it's the same thing, but they're actually two different things, right? Motor control is just in the moment, how are we creating movement? How are we creating postures? We're sitting in chairs right now. How are we doing that in the moment? And motor learning is more about the process over time when you're training and trying to refine movements. How is the nervous system changing, and how are performance outcomes changing? Motor control in general is two things, right? It's an open loop control and closed loop control. How do we control actions that we can't use feedback information, and how do we use feedback information to modify? So it really comes down to, from a broad perspective, you have open loop control, which are fast actions. You have closed loop control, which are slow actions. So something like hitting a baseball, right? Or the downswing in golf would be an example of open loop control. And closed loop control would be something like if you're being really neat about your signature, your handwriting, or maybe a surgeon is doing a specific procedure, and that requires a lot of accuracy, and it's usually going to be slow in duration. And so those are going to be under closed loop control. So in general, when you're describing human movement, human movement falls under those two categories. Is it governed by an open loop control system or a closed loop control system?
Are those ever tied together? So I think of, for example, a Sung JM, where he's very slow to take it back.
Yeah.
Or Hideki, where there's like a large pause, or there's more intention going back than there is in the downswing.
Yeah.
Or are those just completely unrelated?
Well, so historically, like if you look at most textbooks on motor control will say some actions like baseball or sprinting or javelin, whatever, they'll categorize the type of control based on that activity. So they'll say, oh, the baseball swing is under open loop control and distance running is under closed loop control, right? But one of the exciting things that in the past, man, we looked at the data during COVID, during that shutdown time, where we look at some of the data we had, and we have evidence that we have open loop control in a single motor action. So you brought up something like the golf swing that has a Sung JM, and you have a slow backswing and then a fast downswing. The slow backswing, we would say, is governed by closed loop control, and then a fast downswing is governed by open loop control. And we have evidence of that, and we use the standing long jump to do that. So the standing long jump has a slower loading phase, or the body is lowering, and then you have the jumping phase, which is a faster phase. And we use a variety of biomechanical and motor control techniques to basically decipher that downward phase, and the standing long jump is governed by a closed loop control, whereas the propulsive, you're jumping towards your target, is standing long jump, is under open loop control. That work is being published right now, but commonly in the textbook form, they just say open loop control is running as fast as you can, and closed loop control is, writing your signature, that type of thing. But we have evidence in the lab that you can have open loop control and closed loop control in the same motor action. And that discovery has actually really helped me from how I work with the golfers, the professional golfers that I work with, in terms of training and development, strategic things that they can do within a tournament, but mostly what they're doing in their practice. So it's kind of like a really nice example of how we found things in the lab that wasn't disseminated yet, per se, in the research realm or in the publication realm or in the mass public, but it was something like that my players got almost immediately from the lab and kind of instituted in their training programs.
So how would they be instituting that in their training programs, for example?
Yeah, so one of the things that we don't worry about too much, which, and we'll talk about how much information athletes should consume later on. One of the things that knowing that open loop and closed loop control is within one motor action is that we don't have to worry too much about the downswing. So we can almost take out, when I say worry about it, like really think about it too much. So we're almost eliminating half of the action, right? In terms of like what we're trying to think about or what we're trying to control, because that we know once you start a movement that's under open loop control, you really don't have any control over it anymore. It's just like, it's going to happen and then it's going to stop and then that'll be it. But the closed loop portion of it, the backswing, you have a lot of control over that. And how the coaches that I work with, our really important position of the golf swing, if you can say position, the golden moment is going to be that top in transition part, right? Because you have a lot of things that build up at the start of the swing to that top in transition part that you should have right or that you need to get right, but very controllable because it's under closed loop control, slow in duration, right? That you can prepare in the backswing for. But once the downswing happens, it's like the train has left the station.
I think of, for example, Sam Snead, right, who has a leg kick where he's shifting his weight and trying to start dynamic movement earlier.
Yeah.
Is there a way to extend the open loop nature of part of the downswing to the entire golf swing, where it's all more of this dynamic movement rather than this?
Yeah, I mean, you could. I mean, one of my colleagues and friends, Sasha McKenzie, will say one of the ways that you can increase swing speed is increase backswing speed. So if you took that to the furthest edge that you possibly can, right, yeah, and did the backswing as fast as you possibly can, you can, in a sense, make the backswing open loop control.
That's fascinating.
And so from that perspective, like, I mean, that would be really fast backswing, right? That would be a fast, think about that. That's like as fast as the downswing, which is over 100 miles per hour for, a select few players.
There's probably other negative consequences.
Yeah. And so the thing is, here's the cool thing about really fast movements is really fast movements are consistent. They're less variable. But if you're off target, you won't be able to correct if you're off target or not. So you can be consistently off target with a very fast motion. But if you're well trained, then you can be consistently on target, right? With the slow movements, you have a lot of movement variation. But slow movements allow you to vary your movements. It could be a good thing depending upon the situation.
So historically, from what I understand, like let's say I drew a line very slowly. From what I understand, that would actually be a straighter line than if I did it very quickly, correct? Or like on average, it would be straighter.
If we looked at the straightness of the line, your straight line would be, your line would be straighter if you did it as fast as you possibly can.
Interesting.
But if you did it as slow as you possibly can, the straightness of the line, that's the movement variability, would be demonstrated in that.
Okay, so I'd probably be able to get it closer to the whatever little outline I would have.
Correct.
Consistently, but there would be more variation.
Well, when you bring in an accuracy component, right? So this is the thing that people confuse all the time with really fast movements. Really fast movements have movement consistency, meaning the trajectory of the movement, right? But their endpoint can be very inaccurate, especially if you're not trained. So if that line you're trying to get it to a particular endpoint, the slow one you'll get to that endpoint, the goal endpoint, repeatedly, but the fast one you might miss it. But the trajectory of the fast one is going to be, the movement trajectory is going to be consistent.
Well, I think we can all extrapolate that to sports relatively easy. Before we dive deeper into this, I'd love, you're passionate about this topic. We're diving pretty deep into technical things already. I'd love to learn how you got interested in this and maybe how you got involved in professional sports and things along these lines as well.
So I think a lot of it was, luck, like when I think about it, right? So, I'm an Asian kid that grows up with immigrant parents, and what are the career options? The career options: I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer. So I go into UCLA thinking I'm going to be a doctor. I was a physiological science major, and I was like, did my internships in hospitals and I couldn't see myself there. I always grew up playing sports though, and I always was really intrigued by what made me play better, like in the training things that could make me play better. So that was something like inherent in me. And so when I got to UCLA for my undergrad, I was lucky that I was there because it just so happened that one of the Jedi masters of motor control was there. It's the late Richard Schmidt. And you mentioned schema theory before. He was the kind of the inventor of the schema theory, right? So I got really lucky that he was there because when I was looking for classes to take that weren't med school related classes, I came across his intro motor control class, and I read the intro. And as soon as I read the intro, I was like, man, this stuff looks awesome. But I didn't want to get my hopes up. Went to the first day, and I was lucky also because he's a fantastic lecturer. So not only did the content really, really get me excited, but he was a really good lecturer. So it was like a double effect. And so I got to know him really well. He learned my passion for it, and he recommended my PhD advisor, who was like another Jedi Knight in the field. His name is Richard McGill. And so I went from my undergrad straight to a PhD program. And then in my PhD program, I had it was another lucky opportunity. I had a buddy who was studying, his emphasis was biomechanics. His name is Mike Young. He's awesome in what he's doing now. He has his own facility out in North Carolina, but his emphasis was biomechanics. And so USA Track and Field, like they came to like our department and they asked, do you have anyone that can help us with our Olympic athletes, basically? And Mike and I were the guys that got chosen, or I don't even remember how we got hooked up with USA Track and Field, but we were the guys that were helping USA Track and Field high performance athletes. It started with just like with biomechanics. And then as time went on, they needed a motor learning specialist. So I became the motor learning specialist for all the medal contending athletes in USA Track and Field. I think I was still in grad school at the time. But it worked out well because I didn't know a lot about track and field, but Mike did, because Mike was a decathlete. He was an assistant volunteer coach at LSU, who has a phenomenal track program historically. And they won national championships while he's there. And so we trained like we were track athletes in grad school. And so I really got to know the track and field really well. And was able to take those motor control and learning concepts that, I was taught as an undergrad, was learning as a grad student, was researching on. I got to apply those to the medal contending athletes within USA Track and Field.
So what was the jump like, or what did you learn from going from more on the research side and study side to the application with actual athletes?
I'll tell you a funny story. So there's this thing called focus of attention. It's basically how you think about your movements, like while you're doing them. It's a concept that I use all the time with my lower level players and my professional players. But it's basically, if you think about your body movements while you're doing your sport activity, you're not as good as if you're thinking about the effects of your body movements. So think about it like from a baseball context, right? You can either think about how your arms are positioned during the swing, or you can think about where the bat is positioned during the swing, right? You could say the same thing for golf. But at that time in grad school, this focus of attention research just started to come out. And it was kind of it was still a motor control paradigm. So how you can influence people in the moment, which people love, because you get like these super fast changes. And they're positive, like biomechanically, like I go through the research, but all the physiological, biomechanical changes that you get are almost like instant. So people love it. And so that research is starting to get really popular at the time. And if you look at the research, it's really overwhelming which one is better. When you think about how coaches coach often, or give instruction, oftentimes it's very body related, right? Or it's very limb related, like move your hand here, move your arms here, move your legs like this. It's traditionally been done like this. But this research came out and says that's not the best way to do it. And let me show you all the data that demonstrates that it's not the best way to do it. So instead of thinking about how your wrists are moving, think about the handle of the bat or the handle of the ball, like something like that. If you're throwing a ball, if you're kicking a ball, instead of thinking about like trying to put draw spin or fade spin on the ball, think about how you want the ball to rotate, right? And so this research came out and it was really, really apparent which one was better. And so I had the opportunity, because my role within USA Track and Field, I was like a generalist in terms of I applied motor learning to all the different events. And so the sprinting biomechanist asked me, he's like, hey, can you come and help a couple of athletes that we have? And One of them, I think, was like either the silver or bronze medalist in the Beijing Olympics and training for the next one. And the other one was the best female sprinter that we had at the time. And they were basically just working on sprint mechanics. So basically the first 10 meters. And what they were trying to do, without getting into the weeds of sprint mechanics, they were basically trying to shorten their steps, try to get to the ground faster so they can apply forces. And the biomechanist at the time was a really famous biomechanist in track and field. His name's Ralph Mann. Had been working, had a model, had an expert sprint model, was showing the model, giving them biomechanical advice, and he couldn't get them basically to do that step pattern. And so he calls me in and we work on it. And I go, I got it, right? I'm going to use this focus of attention concept. And I know the research is like dead on, right? It's one of those things in the research where you find very few that work in the opposite. It's always like, it's super apparent which one is better. So I'm like, I'm going to use this focus of attention research. It's going to work because the research is overwhelming. So the first athlete comes in and we're like, okay, we can't talk about body parts, right? And I'm like, get them to think about, well, actually the first thing is I gave them the cue. I can't remember what cue that I gave them, but I gave them an external cue and it didn't work.
Like something off feeling like their relationship to the ground or something like that.
Something to shorten their steps. I can't remember what it was, but something to shorten their steps, but it was not body part related. It didn't work. And we knew if it was working or not because Ralph had his high-speed video, he had the timing laser, so we knew if they were getting faster, if we knew if their movements were getting better. And it didn't work. And then he tried it. He tried to come up with something and it didn't work. And I'm like, the science is pretty solid. And I go, well, how about this, Ralph? How about we have the athlete think about how to get their steps shorter, in a sense, without thinking about their movements. So Ralph goes over and gives them the instruction. You kind of see the athlete kind of think for a little bit. We're like, you got it? And we're like, okay, you got it. Runs. And then Ralph goes, look at this. So look at the times got faster, right? And then I go, well, what about the kinematics? Like, what about the movements? It's like, look at those steps. The movements are better. So you get a double effect. Oftentimes you go, oh, the movements look good, but the outcome was like, the overall outcome wasn't so bad. Like that happens a lot in motor control and learning. But this one, we got better movement and we got better outcomes in terms of their running speed or their running times. And sort of like, I was like, oh, let's go find out what it was, right? And so we go over and ask the athlete, and it was like, oh, I was just thinking about baby steps. And you think of like baby steps, right? And they're like, come on, are you serious? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, if the research, there's no mention of any body part or anything in there, right? And so the next athlete comes in. There's like, we got it solved. Baby steps. And it doesn't work with the next athlete. So we're like, you got to be kidding me. And so we go the same thing. Okay, say the next athlete, same thing. Okay, think about something that'll get steps shorter, but don't think about your body parts. Thinks about it for a while, does it, see the same thing. Runs faster, movements get better. And we're like, what did you use? Quick steps, right? And so then it was like, that was the moment. If you ever ask me in my career, what was the moment where is the question you asked, how the research and application combined, it was that moment. Because I'll say this to my students, it's like, it's your job to know the research, fundamental. That's your fundamental job, is to know the research. But then you're not even halfway there yet. Because then you have to do you can call it the coaching part, the dissemination of information part, or the making the research, not the research sounding part. It's the art of it. And what we found there was like the external focus of attention effect worked, just like it did in the research. It worked in real life with really high level athletes who don't have a lot to improve on, right? It's really easy to help someone who has a lot to improve on. It's like, man, I can get that guy or that girl to improve just like that, just because they're so bad. But with high level people, it's really hard to get them to improve because they're so close to the ceiling, right? And so we found it just in one rep. Right? We found those kinematic differences in their running speed, and we found the movement characteristics that were better. But how we applied the science was really important. It's like you can't give it one to all. It's maybe some people interpreted things a little bit differently. And so that was the aha moment of, man, you have to manage the data, you have to manage the research, and then you have to manage how you're applying that research.
To me, there's such an important lesson in that. And I've seen it in my own experience in sports. I've seen it in professional athletes as well, is that the paradigm historically has been you fit the student to the coach.
Yeah.
Right. I come in to this cookie cutter swing philosophy. I come in, I tell you exactly how to shoot.
Yeah.
And you adapt to my coaching philosophy. And from what I've seen, particularly with Roger Federer, is that everything is catered to the student. Obviously, there's fundamentals that need to be built. There's some of these other things.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting in that specific example is these athletes are really good for a reason, but they need to have the tools, or they need to be able to like be given the right resources to make the results. You can't just give them the end result because it won't work for them in the same way.
And much easier to do in like single athletes. What do we call it? Like a sport in which there's no team, right? You just have like in tennis or in golf or in sprinting, right? You don't have to worry about a team per se, so it's a little bit easier to do. But even the team dynamic becomes a lot more complex because then you have the multiple individuals and then you have the interacting individuals. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to do. But I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of like what we discussed at the top with Mark. It's like coaches can't be, this is my style of coaching and you got to fit it. That's like really caveman-like approach. It's really a matter of what are all the tools that I have available to make my athlete better, right? They could be the different sports science tools. They could be the different manners in which you interact with the athlete. But yeah, that old school, that dies off, and you can kind of see it dying off.
Well, I might resend what I was saying a little bit. I think it could work if the athletes are very self-selecting and they say, oh, this person's style, it matches how I think, and I'm going to go in and do that, right? But that's probably fewer and far between now compared to what it was before.
Yeah.
In terms of the athletes themselves being able to find out what a style someone is pursuing or what their tenets are, it is a little bit easier for them to self-select if that's public or it's clear that they have a singular style. But I think overall, a more effective coach or teacher is able to adapt in the way we're describing.
Then it becomes a probability game. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like, do you want to have a low probability of having like that team or that athlete that matches you perfectly well, or higher probability of saying, okay, what are the athlete's foundational needs? And then sometimes athletes will say they need some things, but that's just a preference. And preferences are something else, right? Rather than kind of core needs of what requires them to get to the highest level.
So when we're talking about core needs, how does that relate to like the basics of motor learning control?
Yeah.
To me, that's something I think is pretty important. Maybe we should back up and level set like, hey, what exactly is this? And then how does that relate to practice or skill acquisition?
Yeah, I think the core needs is, well, first of all, is understanding you have movement that occurs in a competitive situation, and then you have movement that occurs over long periods of time in a non-competitive situation, the practice or the training. And how someone views a competitive environment to a practice or training environment, and when I mean someone, that's either coaches or athletes. That's really important. And so I'll give you an example. Is one of the things I have 2 kids and they're developing junior golfers, and they play tournaments, right? And some parents take the approach of, we're gonna win, we're gonna try to get the trophy or whatever, trying to win the tournament. I think that's a little short-sighted. And so what I mean by that is like when I tell, like my kids have like these training goals. We use the tournament when they're been doing this since he was like 8 years old. When he's like 8 years old, because who cares if they win if they're 8 years old? We're using that tournament as a training experience, right? Rather than this is the U.S. Open or the U.S. Junior Am or something along those lines, and you have we're no longer training, like we're trying to win. And so I think that perspective is really important. If you have that perspective, then it really influences the view of performance, and it really influences what's important at that specific time, and it influences how you're going to structure things over a calendar. And so that just comes from the basics of learning or of knowing what motor control and what motor learning is. Most of the time that any coach spends with an athlete or any athlete spends in training, most of it's going to be a motor learning thing. What are you doing to refine movements, learn new strategies, new cues from the opponents, right? And how are you scheduling that, or how are you managing that, or how are you planning for that over a course of time? That course of time could be a week, it could be 2 days, it could be an entire season, which is going to be very different from how you're viewing your season. And different sports can do it differently too. In college football, you can't really afford to lose a game in college football if you want to get to the championships. Yeah. But like in baseball, it's 162 games. So one game doesn't really matter or matters less in the whole scheme of things, like percentage wise, right? Same as the NBA. If you have load management, they're not going to load manage in the championships or in the playoffs. They're not going to load manage in college football like in a college football game. And so different sports have different needs in terms of how you approach training. Because some sports that have the expanded seasons and the mini games, you can treat games like training if you're periodizing for that thing that's way more important in the future. But in college football, your first game is the most important game. Like you could look at each as like small championship games if you have that type of team or those aspirations to get the championship level. So I think the core thing is really understanding the difference between motor control and learning, and understanding how they influence the training environment and then the competitive environment.
So we have obviously a time frame. We have a specific outcome that we'd like from the motor control system.
Yeah.
Which would be to, let's say in golf, be as replicable, or actually it's not replicable, as to have as much control over the golf ball as possible.
Yeah.
Normally, right? It's not necessarily to repeat the same swing.
Yeah.
From what I understand, that's very difficult.
That's a subtle difference or a subtle way to phrase something that you said, but extremely important, because people think of grooving movements or grooving actions, or people think of doing the same thing, trying to do the same thing over and over. That's a crappy approach to take, just because we haven't evolved that way as human beings. Like we have really good research, human movement research, that explains the importance of movement variability and how it's very healthy for us for the long run in terms of injury prevention, those sorts of things. And so if you just kind of take nuggets of that and say, well, we weren't really evolved to be super consistent or super the same with movements to protect our bodies, right? That's the way our systems evolved. And then you're expecting someone to be ultra precise over and over and over again. You're really on a journey to nowhere, and you'll never get to that goal. And so how you phrase it is, we can control the club different ways and still have a very similar outcome of the ball, like regardless of what it is. So I think it's really important that you mention that, because that opens up what we were talking about earlier in terms of movement variability, and how, doing movements in a variety of ways is actually very helpful for the learning process, and then later on the performance scenario.
So the learning process of that, of essentially in this time frame, being able to control the ball how it is being able to improve the rate that I can control the ball, the speed at which that I can do that, and the resilience of that under different stimuli, in different scenarios. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah. Are you talking about when the different stimuli, in the competitive situations?
Yeah, in competitive versus practice.
Yeah, we call that transfer. So in the motor control and motor learning world, we call successful motor learning, learning movements. We call those usually, that's really good transfer. And so the reason why we call it transfer is because transfer is all about how well or how good you can adapt what you trained to a maybe slightly different or novel scenario in the competitive environment, right? So maybe you hit a ton of pitches in practice, whether it be softball or baseball. You hit a ton of fastballs, and it could have come from your best pitcher on the team, but the next best pitcher on the other team is going to have slight differences in terms of delivery, in terms of release point, maybe in terms of even velocity and where they're placing the ball. And so how well you can adapt after your training, how well you can adapt to that slightly different situation or new situation In the motor control learning world, we call that transfer. In the pragmatic, everyday sports competitive world, we call that being a gamer.
One of my least favorite things to hear. The gamer ignores statistics.
Yeah.
Oh, he's a gamer. He'll turn it on when it matters. And I'm like, well, the data does not suggest.
Yeah, we always have those terminologies like, oh, he's just a practice player, or she's just a practice player. They can never transfer over into the games. It's like I always look at it as they're probably doing well in practice because of the way that practice has been designed. I can make my athletes look really good in practice, but it's going to be at the sacrifice of some competitive performance, right? I can manipulate performance in practice really easily just with certain strategies.
So that raises the question, should athletes look bad in practice?
That's a really good question. I would say they should not look bad in practice and they should not look good in practice. They should be committing errors at the proper level. So I'll give you the example. If you bat 300 in Major League Baseball, at the end of the career, your long career, what does it get you?
Hall of Fame.
Yeah, it gets you in the Hall of Fame, and probably you earned a lot of money on the way. But if you shoot 30% from the free throw line,
you're Shaq. Or you're worse than Shaq.
Shaq's better, right? It's probably not a good thing unless you could do some other things really well. Let's do it this way: like fairways hit on the PGA Tour, it's like what, like 60%?
60 is pretty good.
60%
In
or
this day and
something
age.
like yeah, we'll say like PGA Tour average, right? But if you hit 600 in baseball,
You'd be
it's
best
unheard
ever.
of.
Yeah.
And so the reason why I bring those statistics up is because when you talk about being bad in practice or being good in practice, you should be really looking about what is the acceptable success rate within the given activity. And so the advantages that I get to have when I'm working with players within practice is I can view the success rate relative to what their peer professionals would do in a competitive situation. And so if PGA Tour players are hitting 50 to 60% of their fairways, like in a competitive tournament, and I'm giving my player a drill and they're only hitting 10% of the fairways, I know that I'm smashing my player in a good way. Sorry, not in a good way, in a bad way. It's too difficult of a practice situation. So I need to modify that based on the success. So to kind of like answer your question, it's the amount of bad. You have to have the right amount of bad in practice and the right amount of good. And that's determined based upon the sport that you're playing and what's accepted as good and bad.
So, I mean, that's the other side of the coin of the right amount of challenge, right? So something I've heard, and I don't know if it's scientifically backed, so it's probably good that we're talking about it, is that, for example, in jiu-jitsu, you should compete or practice against a third of people that are worse than you, a third of people that are around your same skill, and a third of people that are better than you.
Yeah.
In the sense that you're able to, and like intuitively that makes sense to me, is that when you're practicing against people that are worse than you, work on things.
Yeah.
You're practicing against people that are equal to your skill. You're like pushing yourself to the right competitive level to find out like what you can actually execute on people with skill.
Yeah.
And then when you're competing against people that are better than you, you are finding out where your clear weaknesses are. But that is more of like a psychological learning rather than a motor learning.
Well, I think, the thing about learning is like learning as a psychological thing, but how it's different from like, say, learning that they would teach in a psychology department is there's movement that's required. And then when you bring in movement, if you even look at the learning research, there's different things that happen when you bring in multi-limb coordination, right? And then you bring in people's genetic traits of motor abilities, right, that mom and dad give them. But I think you highlight really well in the jiu-jitsu example about how there's a progression there. And the players that I work with, there's always a progression. Usually where they have really good successes, I call them, that's the warm-up or warm-up style things, right? And then towards the end, that's where, the challenge, the complexity, and the difficulty level become greater, depending on where we are in the practice or training cycle. But yeah, there are those levels of, It could be levels of success that you're trying to foster, like that you're targeting. It could be the levels of complexity, or it could be the levels of difficulty that you're really trying to get at. And like when you talk about practice design, that's the macro perspective of what you're trying to do from practice design. Do you have a progression, and do you have the right amount within those progressions, the right amount of performance level?
That makes sense. I think we've beat around it a little bit. I'm interested, what are like the fundamentals of an effective motor learning approach? So let's say I wanted to ingrain, and that might be like a 4-hour
That's a
long
big question, Ken.
but let's say I wanted to ingrain, let's say I'd never played golf before.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get some semblance of an effective golf swing. What are the things that I must do, or like would make that as fast a learning process and effective a learning process for me as well?
So the terminology, Mark Blackburn and I use a very similar terminology. I don't know. We were probably using it at the same time. And then when we first met, we were like, oh man, we're using the same terminology here. But we always talk about ingredients and recipes. And we have to have the right ingredients, and then you have to have the right recipe. So it's like if you're making something and your ingredients, if you're making food and the ingredients are rotten, the recipe could be the best recipe ever. It's going to taste like crap. Right? Same vice versa. You can have the best ingredient food and the recipe sucks and you burn it and it tastes like crap. Right? So in the sports context, I always look at the ingredients as the necessary biomechanical features of the sports action. Right? And within the teams that I work with, I always tell the players, I'm not a coach. I don't give swing advice, right? Because that's not my role. But I get swing advice or ingredients from the coach. And so I would say fundamentally, you have to have an idea of how you should be moving biomechanically, whether it be an efficiency thing, whether it be a safety thing, or whether it be a sheer performance thing. You have to have some biomechanical requirements. Me and my colleague Mike Owen call them critical factors. They have to occur. If they don't occur biomechanically, you don't have success. So once you have that, then it becomes a training situation. That's the recipe part. And that's usually in the players and coaches that I work with, that's my specialty. That's what I help them out with. So it's really about, if you were to say the core, right? You're asking me to sacrifice a lot here, Ken. But if you say the core, I would say you have to have some well-designed, what's called practice variability. That's doing things the right way and doing things maybe the wrong way. That's really good for the nervous system, really good for motor learning. And it's really stripped down. There's a lot to that. I would say there's also an important aspect of communicating the biomechanics to the player, or how we translate the ingredients to the recipe. And that's how coaches are giving instruction. And we hit on this with the internal, external. So coaches who are overly, first of all, you have the volume of information, right? We always want to keep the volume low. And then you have what's in the information. And now we know what's in the information from a research standpoint, that we shouldn't really be giving people instructions that are super body awareness oriented, just because we know from a research perspective that's not the best way. Now you might ask me, does it just make you a terrible performer if you think about your movements? No, it doesn't. But we're thinking about optimizing and maximizing, right? We're thinking about getting the best out of a player. So if you want to try to get to the best out of the player, they're not thinking about movements, they're thinking about movement effects. So I think we can make it the most broad, right? I would just say it's have the proper mechanics of how the sport action should be. And then once you have that, disseminate that information really well. And that's a volume thing, and that's a quality of the verbal instruction you're giving them. And then give them some opportunity to move differently, not always the ideal way. Sometimes moving slightly non-ideal ways is a good thing for learning.
So you have the biomechanics, and then the golf swing, the instruction is based, or what you want the athlete to do is largely based on the biomechanics.
Yeah.
And then how you ingrain that and how you communicate it in some ways is where you're really creating a lot, the largest impact.
Yeah, it's the communication of the information, and it's literally what are they doing from repetition to repetition, like managing that. Most people do drill type work, and drill type of work is very repetitive. And so when I mean managing what they're doing on each repetition is how repetitive are you being? Whether you're being very repetitive, doing the same thing over and over, or doing slightly different things. That subtlety of what you're doing from rep to rep has massive effects on the motor learning process and the competitive performance process. So typically we mentioned this earlier, when you have practice players, I can make practice people look really good in practice. Usually I put them in really repetitive situations. You're like, oh man, they hit 90 out of 100 shots, but they missed the first 10 shots. And by the way, they're only probably going to get 3 shots in the game. And so you can be confused with the way drills are set up.
So what is the role of repetition and those more drill-like things versus the role of maybe a gamified approach or something like that?
I'm glad that you asked that. How do I want to start this? So a colleague of mine who was in graduate school with me, his dissertation topic was, how do you progress a practice session with a lot of repetition? And when I mean repetition, doing the same thing over and over. And how should it progress to where at the end you're not doing the same thing over and over? And he has some nice data that shows you shouldn't be doing the same thing over and over throughout your practice. Like there should be some progress there, right? With slowly reducing repetition over the course of practice.
And is that intra-session or over the course of whatever time
Well,
period, or both?
in his particular dissertation, it was I believe it's a 1-day session. But you can look at it more on a macro level too, right? And it would be designed out a little bit differently on a macro level. But I'm not a huge fan of thinking about or using the term repetition. I like to use volume a lot better, because repetition has a couple different meanings depending on who it is that you're talking to. Some people think of repetition as doing the same thing over and over, but some people may think of a repetition as just like that's one trial, that's like one swing. So I like to think about it in terms of volume. And so if you have volume, you're going to have an X amount of volume, right? Whether it's 100 throws or 50 kicks or 75 swings, right? You're always going to have that. Those are things that you're going to have to decide on based on your time availability. But then you have probably what you meant was, are you doing the same thing over and over and over again? And so you shouldn't be, basically. I like a lot of repetition in warm-up, but I don't like a lot of repetition in the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of practice. But having said that, it also depends on who you have in front of you. And so the elite players don't need a lot of doing the same thing over and over again unless you want them to feel good about themselves, which there's a place for that, right? Where they do feel good about how they're doing, because we're looking for small margins, right? And a perception of how you're doing, whether it's accurate or not, is valuable in a high performance situation. But it really depends on who you have in front of you. If you have a beginner, there's going to be a lot more of the same thing from trial to trial than if you had, a higher level performer. That's not going to do them much good. And it really comes down to a difficulty issue, right? When you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, in general, it's kind of like an easy style of practice. But when you have change in there, the ease, you take off that ease and it becomes a little bit more difficult when you have to change things.
So that's the same progression for, let's say I'm a seasoned professional golfer, but I'm trying to make a mechanical change. I'm probably going to do more repetition to begin with and then move more into variation or difficulty, or is that a different type of paradigm?
I would treat it the same way. And it also kind of depends, when we talked about the art of applying the science. And so that would also depend on who you have in front of you. If you have that player in front of you that they're tough as nails and they are not going to be deterred, maybe you don't need that momentum with the repetition, right? Or the same thing over and over again. But if you have an athlete that you kind of have to be a little bit concerned about their mindset a little bit. They don't handle failure really well, or not better than another athlete. So you're going to want to build in some of the repetitive stuff because that's going to give them some feel good momentum. But eventually down the line, if they're really good, if they want to be a really good player, or if they are a really good player, the bulk of their practice is not going to be doing the same thing over and over again.
Interesting. And so, I mean, we talked a little bit about the variation. Let's say in an elite athlete, how much variability should there be in terms of like the end ranges of motion or what they're experimenting with? Is more variability good in the sense that they're like growing their map of what they can understand from a sensory perspective?
Yeah.
Or is it, is there a detriment to mass variability in long term?
Yeah, end range of motion in terms of perception is really it's really a gift because it gives you a starting point of where to start with. I call it the gymnastics or the movements of a sports skill. And so the end range gives you a start point for your variability, right? So, and then how much variability is how much that player can handle at that particular time. So I can really smash an athlete by giving him or her too much variability, and they're not going to get much learning out of the outcome. So it's really about finding the right amount of variability for that given situation at that particular time. And then you might ask, like, well, how much variability? Well, we kind of know what we discussed before. If I know a certain criterion level for that sport or a certain success level for that sport, then I'm kind of operating in that zone or within that frame of reference, right? So if I have a baseball hitter that I'm working on mechanics with, and let's say they have a success rate they're hitting the ball at a success rate, we'll say that's 600. I mean, that's really high, right? And that reflects a really easy training scenario. So I might add some variability until I can get it to something that's less easy, right? Or the performance is less. I won't get them to they're batting 100, so to speak, but I'll put them in a good zone of expectation based on that activity.
That makes a ton of sense. And that's something that, for example, from what I understand, Tiger has done very well over his career. He understands those end ranges quite well.
Yeah.
And he's been able to, iterate that. I don't know if that was something that came intuitively or if that was something that was taught, but it's fascinating.
I find like the really good ones, Tiger from an athlete standpoint, John Wooden from a coaching standpoint, a lot of the things that we have in motor control and learning that we have data and evidence for is that in some form or fashion, they've stumbled upon it and they're doing it. Even the players that I meet for the first time, and they're really good players or they're really good athletes, when I'm interviewing and talking to them, they have some things that they inherently do that are consistent with the motor control and learning research. Yeah.
It's funny that you say that because I had a conversation with a coach, Todd Herman. Mm-hmm. So he's famous for his alter ego effect. Yeah. He made the Black Mamba alter ego with Kobe Bryant, is focused on that. And a lot of the athletes that come in, he says the same thing, is they have some elements of using alter egos, of psychological distancing and things along those lines, that they come to them naturally. And, by refining these things, by improving upon them, that's where you get even more value, because a system where you're just getting sort of a hint at it, it doesn't necessarily create a safe framework for it to operate optimally, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, from the specific, like things like alter egos, those are like a variety of tools, right? From a performance perspective, or just from separating yourself from the outcome.
Yeah. Well, it's more that like those athletes, they're embodying some of the, like they're already doing some of the things that are elite performers are already doing. And it's like, it's interesting that you're seeing that people do stumble onto these things, but once you create more of once you refine what they've already stumbled on, you get really good returns on that over time.
Absolutely. And you never know if are they that good because they are doing that's much better than what most people do, or maybe it's just a volume thing where they practice more and they can practice and train more. Maybe it's like an environmental thing of they just had really good parents. Or maybe they just survived their parents, or they were able to survive their parents. Like, you kind of never know, right? But it's always like, I always love it when I hear them doing it, because for me, like, I have data in the lab, right? Data from my colleagues, data from the scientific community, but it's always nice to see the verification from a, high performer standpoint, and says, oh yeah, I get a lot of benefit and this is the reason why. And sometimes the reason why is like match up with with the theoretical explanations or how people are hypothesizing about why a certain theory is working. And you're like, oh man, there's like, that's like the best, to me, that's the best verification of how we control and learn movements.
Well, I love that, because obviously the other focus aside from interviewing on this podcast is case studies.
Yeah.
And so I have a couple things that I've observed in a couple of athletes, and I'd love to get your perspective on those as they relate to motor learning. So something that Kobe Bryant would do is he would practice explicitly with his opposite hand. So when he first got into the league, he missed the majority of the preseason because he broke his right hand playing pickup in Venice Beach.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it was Jerry West who was like, like, he loved that. He's like, okay, I don't care that he got hurt. He would play in like a little league game if it meant that he got to play more basketball. Right. But with that broken right hand, he would go through entire practices like he was a left-handed player. He'd also brush his teeth left-handed. He would really focus on his quote unquote non-dominant hand. Is there value in doing that for athletes in some form of the skill or the movement acquisition that they're pursuing?
Well, I would just say strategically, there definitely is, right? So if he can shoot with right and left hand, dribble with right and left hand, there's a lot of value in that just from a strategic game standpoint. He has more options available to him, and the defenders have to be able to account for more options. And if they have more options, slows their reaction time down, right? So there's all that benefit to it. I think if you look at it from a motor control standpoint, if we take my my late undergraduate advisor's schema theory and says, well, what explains using your preferred and non-preferred hand? And he says it's the generalized motor program, right? And the generalized motor program does not distinguish between, or does not have information for your right and left hand. It's just there's information on how to throw, and you can use your right or left hand to do it, right? The right and left hand is what he calls, like, they're just parameters of their details of the generalized motor program, but they're not the generalized motor program themselves. And so for him, the good thing about it was he had an opportunity that was based on, unfortunate event. But he used that opportunity, and even though he probably wasn't as good as with his left hand, he stuck to it, and that provided benefit. But according to schema theory, is that information on how to do it was there. His left hand just needed the trials.
So by him practicing his left hand, he's improving his, I guess, schema in shooting or whatever it is over the course of this as well, right?
Yeah. So like, think about it from, if we think about it from a baseball pitcher's perspective. And so from a baseball pitcher's perspective, there's we'll just call it the motor ability of throwing accuracy. So the motor ability of throwing accuracy, I'm just kind of like dumbing it down, or like making it a little bit easier to talk about, right? The accuracy skill is not right hand or left hand dependent. We think about it as that's just nervous system dependent. So if you think about, like, if you had a pitcher, right? Pitchers in the major leagues pitch every five days, or I don't know if it's 5 days. What are they doing on the non-pitching days to improve their pitching accuracy?
They'll tell you playing golf, but
Oh, of course. Yeah, you got to do that. That's good for the soul. No. Well, if they're a right-handed pitcher, they need to be able to rest their right side for obvious reasons. But I would argue that they can work on their accuracy of throwing by throwing with their left side. And the theoretical support, or the motor control support through a specific theory, would be GMP. Because GMP, like the throwing action, there's just one GMP for throwing. Doesn't matter if you're right or left. So if you're throwing with your left and you're doing accuracy related work with your left, it's helping the nervous system, which is going to help the right side.
So hypothetically, we both train jiu-jitsu. and this is a fairly fiercely debated in the jiu-jitsu community.
Yeah.
Should we be practicing movements on both sides, or dominant and non-dominant? Or should we, one of my friends says only practice what everyone else's non-dominant side is because you get an advantage. It seems to me like there's a benefit of practicing both, because you're actually still training the overall schema of the skill.
Yeah. The answer to that question is yes to all. And so what I would advise people, like if it's a new technique, right? Let's say we're working on a new technique. We should work with our good side first. And then once we get it with our good side, then we can mix in the bad side, is what we usually call it, right? The bad side.
Both of mine are good. I don't know what you're talking about.
And the reason why is because you have this term, or you have this concept in motor control called bilateral transfer. It just can me doing something with my right side help my left side? And it's absolutely the case, yes. We have evidence that says that. You do something with your right side, it helps with your left side. Does it make your bad side as good as your good side? No, they're not going to be the same. But will you be able to do it? Yes. You just need the reps to be able to catch up. So there is a nervous system benefit if you're just at the very beginning, if we're learning something new, just to use the good side. And then as we get better, we cognitively understand what we're supposed to do from a technique standpoint with the good side. That will help when we start training the left side or the bad side.
So to extend a metaphor, and this might not be accurate, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but we're using our good side. Let's say we can write clearer with it, and we're effectively like outlining a map.
Yeah.
Right. And then if we outline the map, it's a little easier with our good side. And then the other non-dominant side, or the bad side, has some frame of reference to go off when we work through it.
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The left side or the bad side just needs some reps, right, for refinement. But the information that is drawing from the system is the same information that your right side is drawing from.
So taking this in a little bit different direction, Kobe is brushing his teeth, for example, with his left hand. Mm-hmm. That has no necessarily like basketball relevance.
Yeah.
Is getting more dexterous or doing something like that with his left hand, can that help him play better basketball?
Well, I think so you can talk about that question from two perspectives. One from a coordination perspective, coordination requirements, and I would say no. But then you can also talk about it just from a strength perspective, right? And then I would say yes. So where if you look at, just look at tennis players, for example, and then you look at the symmetry of their musculature on the right side and left side of their arms, it's usually very different, right?
Yeah, like Rafa's, and then those right ones.
But I'd imagine if you ask any of the top level tennis players to serve or do anything with their opposite side, they could probably do it. From a coordination standpoint, you look at it and go, yeah, that's a serve. Like you wouldn't look at it and go, they're surfing. Like you wouldn't say something like that, right? You go, okay, that's a serve, this forehand kind of looks how it should look. And probably at their level, they would probably do it. It would look pretty darn good on their bad side. So I'd say from a coordination standpoint, if you want the best performance outcome, what you do from a movement standpoint should kind of match up. You'd want them to match up. But that's not to say that you're not getting any benefit from, like a strength standpoint, which you can't ignore, right? Because everything's going to influence the other.
Interesting. So another thing pulling from athletes, we talked a little bit about Tiger and how he had this working on the end range of motions.
Yeah.
Something I also saw that he did is he would routinely take breaks in his practice and think about what he was working on.
Yeah.
Is there something to that?
Oh, absolutely. So motor learning is unique because there's a physiological component to it. There's a strength endurance component to practicing a motor skill, but there's also a cognitive component to practicing a motor skill. And so it's funny. I had a golf client, and I designed out this practice session for him. He's a good player. He wasn't like tour level or anything, but low single digit handicap. And I designed out a movement plan for him, and he never practiced like that ever before. And he calls me like a third of the way through it, maybe even less than a quarter way through it. And he goes, I'm like so tired. And I go, oh, like, did you have a big workout before or something like that? He's like, no, I'm like mentally tired right now. And it's just by the way that I ordered tasks and the way that I asked him to think about his practice and like what he was doing from a performance perspective. There's a lot of mental fatigue and cognitive fatigue associated with that. And so from a practicing perspective, like Tiger is doing, breaks are really good. I actually encourage breaks, and I actually would encourage the consumption of some calories, right? Some energy. Maybe not so much sugar, right? Because what it may do to your insulin and the drop-off effects and that, how that would have an effect on skill development. But the brain requires energy to do work. And so if you're doing really good work from a motor learning standpoint, it's going to consume a lot of energy. So you need the rest, and then you need to refuel within that particular time. So it's like one of the other things that, he knew to do right, rather than I'm just going to be the tough guy. I'm going to grind it out and I'm not taking breaks. Right.
Well, something that Hank Haney said in his book is that Tiger, when he was practicing, he never was not 100% intentional about the shots he was hitting.
Yeah.
Which I think to me it tells just as much about the practice and like the approach to practice as it does about the breaks in itself, right? Is that in theory, if you're practicing correctly, like you should be tired enough that you might even need the breaks, if I understand.
Yeah. And I think that just probably demonstrates like how he's different. To be fully intentional about each shot, and you're practicing 8 hours-ish a day, I mean, that's really, really hard to do. And so like, if it did happen, I mean, that just shows that I always say it's probably not the best thing to compare Tiger, right? Because he's an outlier. And if you chase an outlier, you're going to be in big trouble. We should just appreciate Tiger for who Tiger is. And then because he's doing some things that he might be the very few humans can do. And so if we try to do that, we're not going to optimize our own development if we do that.
I think that makes sense. I think the way that I would reframe that is that there's things that we can do with the structure of our practice that would force us to be dramatically more intentional about what we do.
Yeah, I would say that there is definitely room for that. But here's a crazy thing from the motor learning research is that we learn things when we don't know that we've learned them.
Interesting.
Yeah, and oftentimes those are the most stable patterns of movement. And so I would never want to discount that. Like, I think that's some of the things that games do. Like you mentioned games, or actually I don't think I got around to games, but that's some of the things games do is you kind of learn unconsciously or subconsciously. The only thing about games is you can't control what people are practicing on really well in the games, right? So like, let's say we went out and played 18 holes and we hit it every green. Well, we're not chipping, right? And we just spent 4 hours playing golf and we didn't chip. And so that's a good example. It's like you can't control the type of things that you may want to work on in game situations. So games have to be placed well, like anything. I like games a lot because they're what everybody thinks games does, the positives, those are the things that I like it for. But from a skill development perspective, it's where do your games fit in the overall plan, and does it make sense where they fit and how much you're doing it.
So what do you think about, for example, like a TrackMan Combine, where that is a specialized game? For those that aren't familiar with golf, a TrackMan Combine is essentially a select amount of shots that you can choose what shots are hit, and they're randomly sorted, and you get a score effectively for how well you perform on that semi-random or that type of that aggregation of shots.
Yeah, it's funny you ask that question because I was just having this conversation yesterday with one of my coaching colleague friends about assessments in practice, like the combine, and I go, they're okay. They're okay if you have nothing else in practice for assessment. But our ultimate assessment, regardless of what sport that you're in, the best form of assessment is is the actual competitive environment. You can't hold too much stock in the combine in that TrackMan combine, because it's very dissimilar to golf. And we can think about all the ways that it's dissimilar to golf. You can think about, well, it's different lies, like could be different weather conditions depending if you're doing indoor or outdoor. Think about the time that takes place between each shot, like all those sorts of things, right? It is an assessment. It's an assessment that I would use, but if we look at it as like a multivariable equation and we're assigning strength of variable with those multivariable equations, it's going to be a variable that's in there, but it's not going to be a heavily weighted variable.
Outside of assessment, in terms of learning, is that ineffective?
Yeah. So in learning, it does something else, right? So when learning, what those combines do in TrackMan is it gets you away from hitting an approach shot 130 yards 20 times in a row. So as I mentioned before, like some variation is going to be a good thing in practice. But if someone says, "Oh man, you got whatever, you got the high score on the TrackMan combine," I'm like,
cool story. It doesn't make me any money.
yeah. I mean, it's good if you get $1 million for having the highest score in TrackMan combine. But I'd rather use your strokes gained approach for the past, 5 tournaments that you played. That's going to be a better assessment for me.
That makes sense. So as it relates to variability, actually, how much variance should we have? So not just in the types of shots we hit, for example, in golf, but maybe like cross sports, cross discipline. Something that I was reading about Federer is that his coaches would sprinkle in soccer drills. They'd sprinkle in him playing squash, different sports, one, to keep him stimulated and interested, but also perhaps to train a more generalized skill set.
Yeah, I think for boredom, it's going to be really good. And I think you mentioned that was something that his team had to really program for, was his boredom. So I think for boredom, it's really good. I think from a strength, endurance, speed, maybe even medical, like for just movement symmetry, or to balance out like some asymmetries he has, I think that's really good. From a skill perspective, I look at it more as how much do those skills, movement skills, transfer over. So it would be something like, let's say Federer was hitting baseballs off a tee, right? Then I go, okay, maybe he's hitting baseballs off the tee with his weak side, the side that like he has some kind of imbalance or something like that. You could say, oh, that's awesome for that, right? Because he's probably going to have fun doing that. I'd had fun doing that. And then he's working, right? Like he's working on his body from that perspective. And then some people would say, yeah, he's got a bat and he's got a ball. He's got a racket and he's got a ball. Well, that's good too. And I'd say, no, not really. And the reason why is because he's hitting a ball off the tee. And so that ball off the tee does not translate, because in tennis, he has to predict how he's going to hit the ball based on information that's not there, that he needs to predict. So there's a prediction component, right? When we talk about the skill component, that's absent with hitting a baseball or softball off a tee, but that's required. So that's not going to transfer well from a tennis perspective. But all those other categories, it's going to be really good for. And so I just kind of, on the flip side of that, you can go, okay, he's not moving at all, but he's just looking at video of his opponents, right? That's going to be good from a skill perspective, but it's not going to be good from a movement perspective because he's not moving, right? He's not balancing out, potential body imbalances that he has that could lead to injury, those types of things. And so from a skill perspective, I look at how much overlap there is with the skill requirements. And when I say skill, I just don't mean the movement requirements, but the environmental demands, right? In tennis, it's all about the environmental demands. In golf, it's not nearly as much. So I look at it from that perspective. So I'm all for them doing a variety of different things, but it may not be necessary from a skill perspective.
Are there any core patterns that are highly generalizable between a lot of sports or a lot of movements? I mean, something I've seen from studying athletes is that there's so much emphasis on footwork, and almost every great athlete, obviously outside of the Tiger series, has mentioned how important the fundamentals of footwork are.
Yeah.
Are there things that essentially transfer across sport or can transfer from improving aspects of learning footwork that are generalizable, or even some other pattern of like using the ground or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think sports actions, there's transferable sports actions. I think if you take hockey, golf, and baseball and softball hitting, those lend really well to each other in terms of that rotational movement that you need, and the combination of translation and vertical components of forces and all that stuff. They have similarities. They have similarities there. Outside of, I kind of like footwork stuff, like footwork ladders, and saying you're going to do this footwork ladder, and then you're going to be the NBA Defender of the Year. I'm like, no, those are like super far removed from each other. Because I kind of look at the ladders as being predetermined steps, whereas real footwork in a game is not predetermined in a way. If you look at, let's say, any reactionary sport, right, requires observation of what's in the environment. Whereas footwork is going to be a component of the reactionary, how you're observing the environment. So I'd be really careful. It's kind of like balance, right? You go, oh, I got really good balance. I was like, man, I can give you 2 tests right now where you're gonna kill one of them, and then you're gonna be terrible on one of them. And so what do we say about your balance, right? So some things are very specific. Like balance is not an overall motor ability. There's specific types of balance that people can be good at and not be good at, and train and not target. And so you just have to be really careful with being like global and saying, oh, I have this general footwork program. It's going to help in basketball, and it's going to help a quarterback in the NFL. And they're like, eh.
So would something like generating speed, not like running speed, but like force, be something that is not necessarily generalizable, but like there is transfer? Because I'm trying to think of, obviously sports specific training is really relevant, probably the most relevant thing. But it's like, okay, if I go to the gym, I can do some sports specific stuff, but I'm training muscles, right? It's not necessarily like I should probably train movements also that are relevant to either my sport or
I think you could train coordination patterns in the gym that will help. It doesn't help you strike the ball better, right? Per se, like directly, but it helps you make the movements to strike the ball better. My buddy in grad school who we did the track and field work with, he would always talk about a study about Olympic lifting and 10-meter sprint times, where really high competitive Olympic lifters, like world-class Olympic lifters, would have 10-meter sprint times that were insanely fast. And they didn't, they're lifting, they're like sprinting, right? So that's just, they're training that biomotor ability of speed, of power.
What about like outside of the physical realm, right? Understanding where our bodies stand in physical space, our mapping of the world, things are along those lines. I mean, something Tiger would do he'd hit golf balls with his eyes closed. Obviously, Kobe and Michael Jordan would shoot basketballs with their eyes closed. Is that, for example, the idea that they're creating a more accurate representation of the outside world in their brain, something that could benefit them in like broadly across all, like a bunch of different skills? Or is it, again, they're just building a model of the world that's specific to their domain?
Yeah, I think what they're doing, or I don't know if they're intentionally trying to do this or not, but we consume different types of information, right, to move in our world. There's proprioceptive information that you're talking about. There's visual information. There's tactile information, right? What we hear, not so much what we smell and taste so much. But I think what they're doing when they're swinging with their eyes closed is they're trying to enhance the requirement of the other sensory systems that help them with a particular skill. They do that a lot in like older adults that they're training not to fall, because like, right, balance is a visual system thing, a vestibular system thing. So they try to target certain sensory systems. So they'll take away one so they can really target and train the other. And so I think what they're doing there is just they're taking out one so they can enhance the other sensory system.
From what I understand, in older adults, like there's a lot less either proprioception or sense of touch in your feet. So generally, you need to improve other senses so that, like, what you're losing you can compensate in that somewhat.
Yeah, they tend to have neuropathies in their extremities, which is basically, it could start out as a tingling feeling, but they lose some sensations in their extremities. With older adults with balance, there's a variety of things. It's their physical capabilities, but it's also has to do with their environmental capabilities. So sometimes older adults have issues with their eyes, right? Like maybe they need bifocals and they have one set of glasses, or maybe they don't have their set of glasses. And vision's really important for balance. And so maybe their vision might be a little bit impaired, even though they're wearing glasses. Oftentimes with older adults, medication can always impair their balance. So you have the physical things that are declining with age, and one of them is their sensation, right, or their tactile sensation. The other one is their other sensory systems are compromised.
Interesting. So what role does the visual system have with like the overall motor learning infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the answer. I'm going to give you the depends answer.
I like these.
Not the depends as in the older adult depends, but it depends on the action, right? And so as humans, we're heavily reliant on the motor system. On the visual system. Having said that, there are nuances to that. So when I speak to players and coaches, I always ask them the question, who here is a visual learner, right? I ask this to my students too. And all the time, the overwhelming majority they raise their hands and say, I'm a visual learner. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you an example. If you're a visual learner, show me. And then in my talk, I'll give them a video of someone drumming, but with no sound. So you can see what they're drumming, but you can't hear anything. And no one can ever learn the drumming pattern. But then if you reverse it and you just say, okay, you're not going to see anything, you're just going to hear it. And then it becomes all the more easier for them. It becomes super easy. You can recognize songs easily, right? That whole thing. And so my point of that is in learning movements, in acquiring movements, you have to understand what characteristic of the movement that you're trying to learn. Are you trying to learn the spatial aspects of the movement? And that would be something that we can see. Are you trying to learn the timing aspects of the movement? You can't see timing. And then now with like force plates, and we can measure ground reaction force in golfers and baseball hitters, you can't see force and you can't hear force, but you can feel force, right? So when you think about our sensory system, in this case you asked about vision, it's important, but it's still not going to be very helpful if your vision's not going to be helpful if you're trying to learn timing, or if you're trying to learn force characteristics. So it's really dependent upon what characteristic of human movement that you want. And then it's kind of funny because me and Sasha were at this golf like think tank trip or whatever, a really cool thing. And one of the kind of nerdy things we did was like, let's swing with our eyes closed and da-da-da-da-da and see what happens. And based on the open loop, closed loop control scenario that we talked about at the beginning, I kind of predicted, I was like, you'll be fine on the downswing. And then it was like, why will you be fine on the downswing? Is because you don't need vision on the downswing, because you're already like, the loop is already going, right? You're in a sense blind already when you're halfway down in the downswing, you're swinging as fast as you can with a driver. It doesn't matter if you can see it or not. And so I want to say that, and you can verify this with Sasho, but I want to say he probably hit the ball better on his downswing when his eyes were closed.
Hey, I mean, there's definitely some stuff that athletes do to, if, for example, Rory, the last I heard, he doesn't look at the golf ball when he hits it. I mean, he looks at like a spot 6 inches above it. Annika Sorenstam obviously is like looking like this. Same with David Duval. And, you know, it is unconscious, but they're like, in that case, what are the yips in that sense?
Yeah.
Which is an interesting one.
You don't necessarily, from a motor control perspective in golf, you don't necessarily need to. And the reason why is because all the information relevant to striking the ball is there. Yeah, it's there because it's not moving. Baseball and softball, tennis is different. That's purely predictive, right? They're really good guesses, but it's purely predictive. So you need the vision to an extent there.
Like
at certain
baseball,
stages, yeah.
Nobody sees the ball hit the bat.
Correct.
Like that's a
Even
myth,
like
right?
that's
Yeah.
like that's like a bad teaching. It's like a bad teaching. Yeah,
all the way
exactly.
in. So I have one more question, and then I want to try to get into like maybe advice for people who are coming up and how they approach their learning and their practice. The last question is related to chunking of movement patterns.
Yeah.
So from what I understand, the simpler the movement, the easier it is to do effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And the golf swing or even a 3-point shot or something like that is complex.
Yeah.
Do athletes break these down, or like what is the minimum viable chunk that we could do or we could focus on to be effective? Is that different for people? How does chunking play into all of this?
Yeah. So chunking is basically you're taking a large amount of information, right, that are separate, right? You can have 10 items and you're making that 10 items into one chunk. From a strict memory perspective, like if you ask people to memorize words, like, 50 words, they'll look at them and they'll make sentences out of the words. That's chunking, right? One sentence and then they have 50 words rather than trying to remember 50 words independently. In sports, you can do the same thing. And that whole attentional, internal, external focus of attention, that is one vehicle in which you can chunk. So if I am thinking about, let's say in a golf scenario, I'm thinking about what the club head position is or what the club head is doing at a particular point in the swing. And that's all I'm thinking about. In order for that to happen, specific body related movements and positions or movements need to happen, right? Like if it's, I want the club here, you're not going to stand on your head with one leg or one arm on the ground or whatever, and then hold the position there. You just won't do that. There's only so many possible movement scenarios that you can get to have the club and moving the way it is or positioned where it is. And so that would be a form of chunking. And we kind of know that. We can see that also from a research standpoint, like the research on attentional focus. You can see it. You can see that because there's less cognitive demand, so they can do like other things, additional things, or there's less attentional demand, so you can do other things. But they're coordinating all these movements, right? But they're just thinking about one thing. It could be the club, or it could be the implement, or it could be imagining in a therapy setting. It could be you're imagining that you're stepping over a small hurdle instead of saying raise your foot as high as you can and then dorsiflex and all that biomechanical stuff. And so chunking is really important from a sports perspective because it reduces the amount of information. And especially if you have to attend to things in your environment at the same time that you're moving or to initiate a movement, you need those attentional resources. So any way that you can chunk, and that's a specific method, internal and external focus of attention, you're going to be in a better position.
Interesting. Okay. So ideally, the more you can chunk, the more you're simplifying things in
Correct.
some sense.
Yeah.
How do we extend chunks? Is that something that we can effectively do?
So I think there's a genetic, I think there's a mom and dad kind of genetic trait that some people have. And the reason why I say that is because working with athletes, I've definitely observed the number of things that athletes can use and be successful while they're doing it. The best was, I don't remember her name, but she was a hurdler. I was at the track and field training center in Chula Vista, Olympic Training Center in Chula Vista, and we're working on her mechanics over the hurdle. And I swear I gave her like 4 or 5 pieces of information. And remember, we can see all these things because we're looking. We have 2D biomechanics, right? To be able to look at like how they're changing their movements. And she's making all these improvements, and she's like 4 or 5 things she's thinking about, like different things that we want her to work on. And it wasn't like I just gave her 4 or 5. I was like, let's try one. Okay, let's try the other. And she was doing it. And it's like me titrating, right? Like slowly. And I'm like, let's try another one. And she's like at 5. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Right? And it was insane. She was the best that I've ever worked with that's been able to do that. But most people are like right around 1.
Exactly.
Right around 1. Now, you can give them one thing and you can like there could be a lot. It could be information rich. But usually it's 1. If it's a high level golfer, I'll give you backswing and after backswing. But usually I'm trying to keep it to 1. But if it's a really good one, it could have a lot of information in it.
Interesting. So as it relates, you're talking about working with athletes. What are the most actionable things that most athletes could do to improve their motor learning process?
I would say even for high level athletes or aspiring high level athletes, some variation in your technique, purposeful variation is good. Not thinking about your movements while you're doing those movements, but thinking about the effects of your movements would be really good. And I think a very important thing is having a coach that's telling you or giving you the right movements to work on. Because what I do on a professional level, I tell my athletes, I say, I'll design practice forever, however you want to move, but if it's wrong, you're going to learn really well how to do something wrong or unsafe, right? Or inefficient. And so I think the coach is always really important because their knowledge about how you should move, whether it be for performance reasons or for safety reasons or for efficiency reasons, all that stuff has to be good before the recipe or the practice could be good. So I would say never take that good information out, right? Good movement information is always good. Have a little bit of targeted variation and think about your movements in the right way.
I love that. Doctor, how can people learn more about what you're working on? Is there anything you want to share? Anything that can help athletes, coaches improve what they're doing?
Yeah, so you can like Instagram. You can always see what I'm doing or what I'm saying on Instagram at Dr. Will Wu. I have a coaching education program, motor learning specific for golf coaches. And I'm super excited in 2024. This year, we're releasing an app called Practice Coach. It's for golfers, and it's basically me combined with a really nifty AI engine. I'm right there in your ears, practicing with you on the range and on the course, just like I do with my players, and using motor learning concepts. And it'll design practice better than I can because after a while. So we're really excited about that, and that should come out in 2024, and then we'll have it for some other sports too after golf.
Amazing. Well, if it's live or when it goes live, I'll put it in the podcast description and in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
And also your Instagram and all those things.
Awesome.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, Ken. I enjoyed it. That was fun.